The Angel of Tarut by Andrew Dobell.
Prologue, Rome, Italy, AD 42.
All that I have prophesied will come to pass when Ishtar gives birth.
The voice did not belong to the seer before them. Instead, it sounded twisted and guttural, not the voice of a woman in her mid-20s. The crowd stood in silent awe of all that they'd seen. Both senators and aides alike were stunned into silence. Simon Gita went to his wife's side where she knelt in the center of the Senate building. She caught her breath and looked lovingly up at her husband through her matted red hair. "Are you well, my sweet?" he asked her gently under his breath so the assembled crowd couldn't hear.
"Yes, I'm fine,"
she replied, smiling up at him. Simon rose to his full height and addressed the dignitaries before him. "You have seen the foresight Helena possesses. She has proven herself many times to you these past few months, passing every test you have given her. Each and every prophecy you have asked her to foretell has come to pass. Do you believe this one?" There were mixed responses from those assembled. Some were nodding in agreement, a few looked unsure, while the rest remained defiant, clearly unimpressed by the prophecy or Helena. Towards the back of the room, a small group of men looked on with cold, stony expressions. Amongst them stood a man Simon recognized, Simeon Cephas. Simon had noticed him a few days ago when he'd arrived in Rome. It sent a shiver down his spine seeing him here. It surely did not bode well. Simon could still remember the last time he'd met Cephas in Tyre. It wasn't a pleasant memory. Cephas watched with dispassionate eyes, contempt etched across his face. "Is it true? Everything she has said, will it come to pass?" Simon turned to the Magi senator who'd addressed him. "I believe so. She has foretold many things. Each and every one comes to fruition, and I believe this one will too, although not for many years." "But she speaks of the Archon's return. She speaks of the end of the world," the senator said incredulously. "That is correct, Senator, but she also speaks of hope. It will not be the end of all things."
The Angel of Tarut, the Middle East modern day. "Thank you," Matt said to the taxi driver and handed him some cash. The driver nodded and took the money, briefly counting it before stuffing it in his pocket. "You brave man coming here," the driver said in broken English. "You British?" Matt nodded. "I am. It's very beautiful here. Thank you for the ride." "No problem. You be careful, yes?" "I will, thanks," Matt said, climbing out the vehicle, shutting the door, and watching the driver turn the car around and drive off over the bridge, back to the mainland via the Riyadh road. He wasn't quite sure how he'd get back to Bahrain, but he'd figure it out, eventually. Adjusting his backpack, Matt turned and looked inland, up the road into the center of town. He'd been traveling through Saudi Arabia and had just spent the day on the island of Bahrain, where he'd been told of the second largest island in the Persian Gulf, the island of Tarut. It was apparently an undiscovered gem and well worth a visit. So he'd taken an early taxi to Tarut and crossed to the island. The cab had dropped him on the edge of Al-Katif, the main urban area on the island. It looked amazing, just as he'd hoped it would. Having graduated from university with a degree in computer science, he'd longed to travel the world. He wanted to have adventures and experience other cultures before he found a job and started his career. Looking every bit the typical tourist, Matt immediately started exploring the streets, ambling through the markets, and enjoying the sights, sounds, and smells of the town. Local traders picked him out from the crowd as an easy target and hawked their wares to him. Everything from rugs to spices were offered, but he'd long since learned how to handle their attentions and keep his money in his pocket. The streets were often narrow and little more than sandy tracks snaking through the buildings. They were busy with crowds pushing their way through, going about their business for the day. The occasional car or moped dodged through the pedestrians, sounding their horns to try to make people move, but it never seemed to help much. After wandering for about an hour through Al-Katif, fascinated by the local culture and soaking up the atmosphere, he began to think about heading out of town. Matt was keen to see more of the island, but something caught his eye through the crowds that looked as out of place as he did. For days he'd seen almost no other Westerners, no one else with pasty white skin. Everywhere he'd looked, the skin was dark and the hair black, so when he saw deep flame-red hair framing an alabaster face, he couldn't help but notice. A young woman stood in the street a short distance from him. Matt could just about make out her head and shoulders through the bustle of people. She seemed to be alone and a little lost, and he wondered if he could help. Making his way through the crowd, he tried to settle on a way to open conversation with her. As he approached, he couldn't help but admire her. She appeared to be a similar age to him, in her early 20s, and he thought she was beautiful. As he got closer, thoughts about how he could chat her up rushed through his head. He had something of a soft spot for redheads. There was just something about that eye-catching hair colour and fiery personality that he found attractive. He'd yet to date one, though, but couldn't help but hope that his luck was changing. She had her back to him as he stepped up to her, her long, bright red hair hiding her face as it fell over her shoulders. "Hi," he said, leaning slightly forward as he spoke. She immediately turned and looked up at him, one of her eyebrows arched in surprise. She had beautiful green eyes that fixed him with their stare and held him there. For a brief, crazy moment, it felt like she was able to read his thoughts or stare into his soul, and he found himself transfixed by her striking features. The redhead had a girl next door look to her, a natural kind of beauty that fascinated him. She was shorter than Matt, maybe about 5'6". She was also heavily pregnant. Really heavily pregnant. She looked literally about to burst. Her hands rested on the sides of her distended belly, her swollen bosom straining her top. Staring down at her bump, he wondered what he must look like. What was his expression at that moment? Surprise? Maybe a look of defeat? Who knew? But as he looked back into her eyes, he saw something else there that he'd missed before. It was a look of fear and slight confusion. Concern for her filled his mind. Something was wrong here. But what? "Are you all right?" he asked. "Is there anything I can do?" Her eyes bulged suddenly, and she winced, bending over as she gritted her teeth. "Oh crap," Matt muttered to himself. She was about to give birth. Help, please," he started to say. A few people looked around, but the girl's hand shot out and grabbed his arm.
No.
She said without looking up.
Don't do that.
"What?"
No help, please.
"But you're about to give birth. We have to do something." Why didn't she want any help? He felt confused. Surely they needed to get to a hospital or something. Raising her head, she looked up at him with gritted teeth. She seemed to be thinking for a moment before her eyes locked back onto his.
Okay, you can help me. Come on.
"What? Me? I'm not sure that's a..." Before he could continue his protestations, she started walking, pulling him along by the arm with a grip like iron, heading to a nearby hotel. "Look, I'm really not sure this is the best idea. I'm no doctor. I have no idea what to do," he protested. But she wasn't listening, and her grip was surprisingly firm. As they reached the edge of the street, he stopped objecting and gave in. She needed help, and seemed fixed on the idea of him being the one to do it. So he sucked down a steadying breath and followed her into the hotel. The girl spoke the local language perfectly and booked a room without issue, gritting her teeth through another contraction as she dealt with the man at reception. They headed upstairs right away, the man behind the desk giving them a strange look as they went. The girl winced and doubled up in pain a couple more times as they ascended the stairs. On reaching their door, the girl handed him the room key and Matt let them in. The room was dank and grim-looking. No place to give birth in his opinion, but she shut the door and ordered him to lock it as she made for the bed. Matt secured the door and turned around to find her pulling off her trousers and underwear. "Ah, crap," he muttered to himself as the reality of what was about to happen slammed home. His heart hammered away at his breastbone as he looked every which way but at the girl. Out the corner of his eye, he could see her levering herself up onto the bed. She sat back against the headboard, her knees up as she huffed and puffed through another contraction. Matt gulped.
I need you to have a look,
she said. What? He asked, suddenly feeling very squeamish and entirely inadequate. Look where?
You know where,
she answered, spreading her legs a little.
Come here and have a look. Can you see anything? I can't exactly get my head down that low.
See anything? Like what?
I don't know. I just know I'm close and you need to help me, please.
His stomach flipped. I'm not a doctor. Isn't there someone we can call? Your husband, maybe? He stammered, feeling desperate.
I'm not married. I'm here alone, and you're the only one who can help me, Now get over here.
Her voice left no space for negotiation. Taking a steadying breath, Matt walked over and gingerly took a look between her legs. It wasn't anything he hadn't seen before, and yet, for some reason, he was terrified. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to see. Maybe a tiny face smiling back at him, but he couldn't see anything. It all looks normal, I guess," he answered with a shrug. "There's no head yet. I can't see anything. I mean, I don't know what I'm looking for." She sat back, closing her eyes as he spoke, and seemed to concentrate on her breathing.
Get some towels and some water. I'll talk you through it. Don't worry,
she said in a voice that seemed way too calm for a lady in labor. "What's your name?" he asked, realizing he didn't know what to call her. Opening her eyes, the girl looked up at him and seemed to think about it for a moment, almost as if she'd forgotten her own name.
Sophia, it's Sophia.
"I'm Matt Walker."
Nice to meet you, Matt. Now, can you please help me?
Matt nodded. This was going to be a long day. The next few hours were a blur of blood, sweat, pain, and joy. He had no idea what he was doing and was terrified of something going wrong. Complications during birth were well known, and if something unexpected did happen, well, he was just hoping it didn't. The delivery seemed like a relatively smooth one. Certainly there were no complications, but Matt was well aware that he was no midwife, so he really couldn't be sure. All he knew was that she gave birth to a lovely baby girl with wispy red hair like her mother, who screamed the place down after her first breath. The birth was not a pretty thing. It was messy and damned scary, and Matt felt utterly exhausted after it, and he had the easy job. He could only guess at how Sophia felt. After hours of screaming and shouting, Sophia laid on the bed, her eyes closed, covered in a film of sweat, looking utterly exhausted. Matt held the baby in his arms, feeling a sense of wonder and amazement about what he'd just witnessed. Holding that brand new, precious life in his arms was a moment he knew he wouldn't forget. Even though he wasn't the father, he couldn't help feeling protective of the new baby. He felt responsible for her in a bizarre way. The baby cooed at him as he held her, and his heart felt like it was going to explode with emotion. Taking a breath, he took in the scene around him. The bedsheets were a mess. It looked like they'd murdered someone, but Sophia didn't seem to care, so neither did he. As he wondered how they were going to explain the mess, the baby began to grumble. Matt tried to comfort her, but his efforts went unrewarded. She didn't seem happy about something.
I think she's hungry,
Sophia said. "Ah, yes," Matt answered, handing her over to her mother, who pulled up her top and started to feed the baby. Matt looked purposefully away, wanting to give her some privacy, and moved to a nearby chair. Sophia seemed to relax too now that the baby was feeding quite happily. Later, the baby settled down to sleep, so Matt set about trying to clean things up. Sophia left him to it and stepped into the bathroom, already looking decidedly trimmer. He heard the shower turn on as he pottered about the room, doing what he could before collapsing in the chair. Having apparently dozed off, Matt woke up a short time later. Sophia stood nearby, dressed and looking beautiful once more. Any trace of the huge bump she'd had before had disappeared, and her stomach appeared flat and trim. Matt wondered about that for a moment, but he'd never been around a woman right after giving birth before, and had no idea how quickly things returned to how they were. Maybe this was normal. "What did I miss?" Matt asked.
Nothing. It's time to leave.
"Oh, yeah. Okay. How's the baby?"
She's good.
"Do you have a name for her?" he asked, curious. Sophia smiled and turned towards the door.
She will have a name soon enough.
Frowning at this odd statement, Matt followed Sophia out the room and had the feeling that the subject was closed for discussion. He wasn't the baby's dad, so he left it at that. He didn't want to poke his nose into business that wasn't his. Sophia paid for the room, and within moments they were back on the street surrounded by the late afternoon bustle of the city. Sophia stopped just outside, smiling up at him with a look of happiness in her eyes.
Thank you for everything you did. I won't forget you,
she said, and kissed him on the cheek. A sizzle of electricity seemed to pass between them as her lips touched him. "Oh, it was nothing. Glad to help, really," Matt replied, blushing.
Goodbye, Matt.
"Will you be all right?" She nodded and smiled.
Goodbye.
Bye." He smiled after her as she turned away, her red hair catching the wind as she walked. It felt like he was in a daze or some kind of fugue state where nothing seemed real. It was such a bizarre thing. He'd just helped a stranger give birth in a hotel room. If that didn't qualify as odd, he wasn't sure what did. Walking away from the hotel, Matt stopped a short distance up the street and turned back around, quickly catching sight of the distinctive red hair through the crowd. He just couldn't let her go like this. She was vulnerable, alone in a strange city with a newborn. It was madness to let her wander off without offering help. She seemed quite strong-minded, but he had to make sure they were safe, and he needed closure. Breaking into a run, Matt sprinted through the crowds, pushing his way through as they protested and shouted at the stupid Westerner. He didn't listen and continued on, seeing the girl disappear around the side of a building. "Damn it!" Matt gasped and ran faster. Rounding the same corner, he spotted her a block away. Chasing after her, she took another turn before he was halfway along the next block. Rounding that corner, Matt scanned the sea of people but couldn't see her. There was a crossroads ahead. Dashing into the middle of it, he craned over people's heads in an effort to spot her. He caught a glimpse of scarlet hair disappearing between two buildings and wasted no time in charging after it. Reaching the alleyway, Matt turned and slowed to a jog as he moved through the tight space. The alley was deserted. Only a few lines of washing hung above him, and the rubbish scattered on the ground. Why did she come down here? Reaching the end of the alleyway, Matt stepped out into the light, finding himself on the edge of a large patch of wasteland. Cracked concrete, broken bits of stone, and other detritus of life were strewn all around him. A burnt-out car, bits of fencing and scrap metal lay here and there, while yellow and green grasses grew up through the cracks. Sophia stood in the middle of all this, nearly 50 meters away, unaware of his presence. Pausing for a moment, Matt watched her with a frown, wondering what she was doing. She just stood there, turned slightly away, and there was no sign of the baby. Keen to find out what was going on and help if he could, Matt took 2 steps into the wasteland before the ground lurched violently. Matt pitched sideways and back into the wall of a building. People on the street behind him yelped and screamed, and then there was silence for a moment as the movement stopped. The ground shifted again and started to shake. Screams came from the street as Matt clung to the wall for dear life. He watched a crack race up the side of the building he was leaning against and came to the conclusion this was a bad place to stand. He ran forward and into the open, heading towards Sophia. She stood in the middle of the open ground, untroubled by the earthquake, with her hands held wide, her palms up, and her head back. Matt noticed the baby lying on the ground at her feet. What was she doing? "Sophia," he called. "Sophia, it's not safe." But she didn't hear him over the rumble coming from beneath his feet. The shaking got worse. Matt fell to his knees as a deafening boom and cracking of rock sounded all around him. A great cloud of dust shot up, consuming Sophia and the baby, as the ground where they stood ripped open. Screaming at them to run, Matt couldn't even hear himself over the noise. Seconds later, his shout caught in his throat as he saw Sophia and the baby again. She was rising up off the ground, slowly levitating up through the dust cloud, the baby a few feet in front of her and floating as well. Within moments they were 30 feet up and hanging in mid-air. He stared up at them in shock, the noise and chaos around him failing to register anymore. I must be going mad, he thought. Rubbing his eyes, Matt looked around for the crane and the TV crew, ready to jump out and say, "Surprise!" But there was none of that. Just the deafening sound of the earth ripping itself apart and people's terrified screams from the nearby streets. Looking up at Sophia again, Matt stared in fascination as blue and golden energy, like lightning, crackled around her and lashed at the ground, making it explode wherever it hit. Thoroughly engrossed in this impossible spectacle, Matt ignored the madness unfolding around him until the patch of concrete he'd knelt on tilted violently and dropped, momentarily leaving his stomach behind. The crack had grown into a fissure and swept past him, widening further as it went. It was easily a few meters across, and the section of ground Matt clung to had moments ago become the edge of the fissure before falling into the crack. It stopped a few meters below ground level. To his left, a wall of jagged rock rose up above him, raining stone and dust down everywhere. Everything shook. The incredibly violent movement caused chunks of rock and boulders to fall down the sides of the fissure, while others were flung up from its depths as pressure built. Having lost sight of Sophia, Matt clung onto the ledge for dear life. The fissure steadily widened. Buildings pitched into it, crumbling away like they were nothing and disappearing into the roiling depths. Time seemed to lose its meaning as he crouched there, watching the disaster unfold. He was terrified, but also fascinated by the destruction and unable to look away. Matt's thoughts returned to Sophia again as he crouched on that rock. What on earth had been happening with her? People can't float. They can't fly. That was insane. He had trouble making any sense of it. He just couldn't comprehend it. For Christ's sake, it looked to him like she had caused this earthquake. And that energy around her, what was that? Magic or something? Was he losing it? Was he going crazy? A distant rumbling roar grew louder. As he watched, a massive torrent of water surged through the fissure, white and foamy as it crashed through the rocks and debris. The crack must have reached the edges of the island and into the sea. It passed below his ledge, but he got soaked anyway by the mist that came with it. Below, the water began to rise up, filling the fissure. Was this the end for him? Thoughts of death and how his passing would affect those close to him bubbled up in his mind. He wished he could say goodbye to them, talk to them once more, and tell them he loved them.
And you will, Matthew, you will.
Looking up, Matt stared in shock at Sophia, who hung in the air before him. She floated with her hand out, reaching for him. Words wouldn't form on his lips as he blinked at the incredible sight. Had she read his mind?
Take my hand, Matthew. You will not die here today,
she said gently and with no real urgency in her voice. The earthquake seemed to have lessened. There was a bubble of calm all about them, now that Sophia had arrived. "How are you doing that?" She smiled.
That's not important, Matthew. What is important is your life, and making sure you don't lose it today.
Gingerly, he rose to his feet, unsure whether this calmness would last. Straightening, he looked up at Sophia again and paused for a moment. He had so many questions, but no answers. But this was neither the time nor the place to start such a conversation. Reaching up, he took her hand, her fingers closing gently around his palm. Beneath him, the ledge fell away as they rose up, weightless. Matt knew he should have been terrified, hanging in midair like that, but he wasn't. Not at all. He felt calm and safe, protected. Looking at the beautiful girl who was saving his life, he saw confidence and wisdom in her eyes that seemed in excess of her apparent years. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you doing this?"
It simply must be. That is all you need to know.
"But the baby. Where's the baby?"
She's safe, she will have her own life to lead, and it will be extraordinary.
What was she talking about? He wondered. It made no sense. He must have blacked out at that point, because the next thing he knew, he was waking up in the back of an ambulance as a paramedic spoke to him in the local language. Shooing the medic away, Matt got up and jumped down out of the ambulance. Desperately, he scanned the area for Sophia, but she was nowhere to be found. People were walking through the streets covered in dust, helping each other as emergency vehicles and personnel moved around, trying to help. Smoke and dust rose from the island in the distance as Tarut split into two new landmasses. Matt wandered through the endless streams of people, hunting for any sign of the redhead, hoping he'd see her, but there was nothing. Nearby, he heard someone speaking English in excited tones. "Yes, a redhead girl. She saved me. She helped me get out of my house, lifted huge wooden beams as if they were nothing." Matt turned and spotted who was talking. He walked over as the man gesticulated wildly as he spoke. "It's true, I tell you. I think she's an angel." "I saw her too," said another person, stepping up to the man. I think she healed my broken leg. I mean, I think it was broken." Matt listened in amazement as two more tales were told of this mysterious red-haired woman appearing in different places and helping people. As he wandered, people were talking animatedly all around him, but he couldn't understand them. Were these people telling similar tales of this angelic redhead? Eventually, resigning himself to the fact that he wouldn't find Sophia again, he made his way towards the edge of the island, hunting for a taxi or something to take him back. He'd seen enough. He needed to go home and think about what had happened to him and what he wanted to do with his life. He'd love to find Sophia again. He had so many questions, so many things he wanted to ask her. He also found himself wondering about the baby. What would happen to her? Where was she? Was she with her mother? He wondered if he could find them. Fragments from news reports about the disaster on Tarut Island.
Seismologists are baffled by a freak earthquake that hit the oasis of Qatif near the island of Bahrain in Saudi Arabia today. The quake was localized to the island of Tarut, its epicenter right in the middle of the island. Preliminary reports indicate a huge disaster for the islanders, with experts predicting many deaths. Estimates of the death toll cannot be confirmed at this time, but are expected to be in the hundreds. There are already calls for humanitarian aid.
Isn't there a connection with the island's name and Ishtar, Professor?
Yes, indeed. The island was named after the goddess Ishtar, an Assyrian and Babylonian goddess, the mother goddess of compassion, love, sex, and war. In fact, she was known as the guardian of prostitutes. Related to the planet Venus, the embodiment of everything female in Babylonian astronomy, and one of the most powerful gods in the pantheon, she became known under a variety of names in a whole range of cultures. The island of Tarut had originally been known as Ish-Tarut, taking its name from the goddess Ishtar, before the name evolved over time to its current form. Some think the island of Tarut might also be the actual site of the Garden of Eden.
Though we're just hearing now that the earlier estimates of the high death toll were apparently wildly inaccurate, as it seems there were almost no serious injuries caused by the earthquake. The worst report so far is of a broken arm. In what some are calling a miracle, everyone else suffered only cuts and bruises. This is incredible.
We can now confirm that the earthquake has indeed ripped open a huge chasm through the whole island, which is, as we speak, filling with water from the Persian Gulf, effectively splitting the island in two. Earlier today, one Saudi politician was quoted as saying, "Ishtar has given birth."
The end. This was The Angel of Tarut, a Magi Saga short story by Andrew Dobell. Copyright 2023 to Andrew Dobell. Audio copyright 2023 to Andrew Dobell. Be sure to find more titles by the author at andrewdobellauthor.co.uk.